Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Welcome to Unbiased Science,
where we bring scientific method to the madness.
We're your hosts, Dr. Jess Dyer
and Dr. Sarah Scheinman.
And this week, we are joined by another brainiac, and I do mean that literally. Dr. Ben Rhine will read his super impressive bio in just one moment. But before we do, we're going to kick off this episode, as we've been doing, with a little bit of a public health update, a little, news cycle recap. So yesterday, which was September 22nd, President Donald Trump did a press conference on the big autism report that we've all been waiting for. He was joined by RFK Jr. and our other federal health science leadership right now. And I'm struggling right now because, truth be told, I listened and watched with my jaw on the floor and tears streaming down my eyes because there was so much misinformation. To focus on the facts, they were talking a lot about a supposed connection between, they kept saying Tylenol, but really acetaminophen and autism. So President Trump repeatedly told mothers that they should tough out fevers during pregnancy and not take acetaminophen because it, quote unquote, causes autism. There were also a lot of falsehoods about vaccines and how we are pumping our kids' bodies full of, quote, too many liquids. We're overwhelming their immune systems. These are all things that we've talked about, of course, on the podcast, and we've debunked several times in our newsletters and our content. They were also talking about something called leucovorin, which is basically a high-dose form of folate, which is typically given to patients dealing with chemotherapy side effects. And this all hinges on this theory. It is truly just a theory right now that autistic children, this is really boiled down in probably oversimplified terms, but that there's some issue with the brain not getting enough folate. And so the idea is that by giving them this drug, that it would flood the brain and bypass that issue. I just super briefly, and again, we have a lot more content planned on this. The research on leucovorin is extremely preliminary. There are 3 or 4 very small trials with about 50 people enrolled. I think the largest one had 80 people enrolled that showed extremely modest improvements in just a couple of outcomes related to communication, but it was subjectively scored. Again, it is possible, who knows, that maybe there is some promise for a subset of autistic children, but we just don't have the evidence yet. So this all felt very preliminary, peppered in with a whole lot of fear-mongering misinformation. Last thing I'll say is that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, came out with very clear statements that Tylenol is one of the only safe medications that you can safely take during pregnancy, and that there is no evidence of any sort of causal link between acetaminophen and autism. And a reminder that fever during pregnancy poses its own very well-established risks, including neural tube defects, congenital heart defects, stillbirth, preterm delivery, and a whole host of other problems. So stay tuned. We'll be tackling this. Sorry if this was long-winded, Sarah. I'm going to shut up now so you can read Dr. Ben Rhine's bio for us, and we could jump in.
All right. Well, we've actually had Dr. Rhine on the podcast before, so welcome back, Ben. Just as a reminder for folks, Ben Rhine is an award-winning neuroscientist, adjunct lecturer at Stanford University, clinical assistant professor at SUNY Buffalo, chief science officer of the Mind Science Foundation, and a renowned science educator. Dr. Rhine's research focuses on the neuroscience of social interactions, and outside the lab, he also teaches an audience of more than 1 million social media followers. Dr. Rhine and his research have been featured on major media outlets, including Entertainment Tonight and Good Morning America, and he has received awards from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, as well as the Society for Neuroscience and elsewhere. Very exciting stuff, as he also has a new book that's coming out on October 14th. We're going to include some links in our show notes so that you can pre-order it. And the book is titled Why Brains Need Friends, The Neuroscience of Social Connection. Thanks for joining us again, Ben, and welcome to the pod.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just, as Jesse, as you were going through that monologue about yesterday's, whatever it was, I have a lot of thoughts, and I want to just kind of throw them out there quickly. Sarah, you mentioned that my research is focused on the neuroscience of social interaction. My PhD was focused on the neurobiology of autism and the genetics of autism and how various genetic alterations influence brain development and therefore may be associated with autism. And just two comments broadly on what you said, Jess. So first off, autism it's called autism spectrum disorder because it is a spectrum. And when it comes to the neurobiology of autism, it is so incredibly complex and multifaceted. You know, there's a reason why it is 2025. We have new therapies for cancer. We developed a COVID vaccine in a year. We have all these medical breakthroughs, and still there's a lot of mysteries surrounding autism. It's because it is so complicated in the brain. There's 1,000 genes that are associated with autism, and they're not all 1,000 replications of the same gene. They all do different things. So there's 1 million different routes, molecular routes to autism. And so to suggest that one single variable, whether it's Tylenol or folate or whatever, is the thing, just inherently implies a failure to understand the condition itself. And so it just does not make sense. Like you said, Jess, there's a good point. It's possible that there's a subset, and we don't know. Maybe it will turn out to be a real thing. But even if there was very clear data on this already, which does not seem like there is, it would still be a reach to say we found it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just does not work that way. It's like saying, oh, we found something. We found the cause of all cancers. It's well, breast cancer, lung cancer, what? The second thing I want to say, which Jesse also mentioned, is that there are various known causes of autism. A lot of the time it's genetic, but then there are other environmental factors. And one of the environmental factors is maternal illness and maternal sickness. And so for pregnant women who are sick and are fighting a fever, at the very least, let's point out that the pregnant women who are sick, who are more likely to use Tylenol because they're sick, are probably the child is more likely to be diagnosed with autism. Is it because of the Tylenol or is it because of the sickness? There's an inherent confounding variable built into that, right? Secondarily, if the advice and the guidance then is don't take Tylenol when you're sick, so then you're no longer suppressing the fever, and then you are exposing yourself to another autism risk factor. So it's not perfectly sound, to say the least. And again, just implies a failure to understand the condition. And I'm sure there will be some major lawsuits coming soon from Tylenol.
Oh, yeah. Well, considering that I honestly lost track, it was at least 100 times President Trump looked into the camera and said, don't take Tylenol, don't do it. And he went so far as to say, not only should you not take it while pregnant, but children shouldn't take Tylenol. And anyway, we can go on and on. Also, just a really quick note, I want to apologize to the, community of autistic individuals. It just feels like they're being used and stigmatized. I think it's horrific. We have received countless messages from parents of autistic children who are feeling guilt, like they quote unquote caused this, as if autism is some horrible thing, which of course it isn't. I mean, there's so many issues with this. I just really briefly want to call out, you're talking about very clear confounding variables, right? So is it the taking acetaminophen, or is it some of the underlying reasons why the mother took acetaminophen or the fever or the chronic illness or pain or whatever it might be. There was a massive study out of Sweden that included 2.5 million children, 180,000 of whom were exposed to acetaminophen in utero. And initially, it found a very slight increased association between acetaminophen exposure and autism. I think it was like a 5% increase. But then they included siblings and they controlled for, genetics and familial whatever, the things that we know are associated with autism likelihood. And that apparent association went to 0. So when we do properly control for those things, there is no association.
Right. And I think what also all of this kind of points to is the need for rigorous, well-designed scientific studies, because if you don't have a well-designed study and you aren't taking into account the proper variables and confounding variables and controlling for these potential confounds in the design of your study, then you're not going to get a true result that's indicative of what's happening in the actual world and the population that you're studying. And I think, Ben, another thing that you mentioned too is like just how complex this disease is from a neurobiological perspective, and how it's sort of almost laughable to be able to point to a single factor that causes something as complicated as autism spectrum disorder. But we see this in other neurological diseases and disorders as well. I mean, in Alzheimer's, a lot of people will point to like a single variable and say, oh, it's aluminum in your deodorant, or like it's processed foods that's causing Alzheimer's. And it's like you're kind of missing the complexity of these disorders when you do these things and you draw these conclusions. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
And Sarah, not funny, but that you just mentioned aluminum. That came up in the press conference yesterday. President Trump alluded to, we're getting rid of the autism. We're getting rid of the aluminum in vaccines. Of course, aluminum salts are used as adjuvants in a subset of vaccines, and this helps them be effective, right? So we could use as few ingredients as possible. Don't know what that means. There is no evidence that aluminum in such small quantities, especially, causes autism. This will undoubtedly impact the vaccine supply if that is in fact true. So it's something that we're all watching. And last thing I'll say is there was this massive study out of Denmark that we've talked about, just recently published a couple of months ago, that investigated aluminum containing vaccines. It was a really incredible study. It was a natural experiment. They actually looked at the dose response, like vaccines that included different levels of aluminum. Anyway, we could talk a lot more about it, but it investigated association with autism, asthma, ADHD, so many health outcomes, and it found no association. So that's another thorn in my side that we'll talk more about. But all right, Ben, you distracted us with your brilliance.
Before we
move
on, I have one more comment just on this topic.
Yeah.
I'm a basic scientist. With the research I've done on autism spectrum disorder is actually looking at mouse models. And there's a lot of research out there in mice and even primates and stuff looking at, the neurobiology of autism.
Right.
And so what I want to point out is that when neuroscientists like myself want to study something like autism, we have to create models of it in animal models, right? So we want to generate mice that resemble autism in some way. And so usually the way that's done is through genetic changes. So there's a specific gene mutation in humans that's been strongly linked to autism. We induce the same genetic change in mice and we put them into social tests. We find, wow, interesting, they're not spending as much time socializing. Okay, so maybe this is a sound model. So there's a few different, besides from the genetic models, there are a few different well-known models of how to, try to induce an autism-like condition in a mouse. And one of them is maternal immune activation, triggering an immune response in the mother. So that's how well established that variable is, that basic scientists use that intentionally to induce an autism-like phenotype in mice. There are some drugs that are used, like valproic acid, which is an anti-epileptic drug, exposing the mother, the pregnant dam, the mouse, to valproic acid also increases the likelihood that the mice that are born are going to show some social changes. There's no Tylenol model of autism in mice, right? Like the fact that this has not even ever crossed the awareness threshold of basic scientists suggests, again, that there is probably not a reliable link there. So I just wanted to point that out, because it's not just humans. We're talking about like all models, all species. Probably something would have popped in and nothing's popping. So
yeah. And I mean, Ben and I were also talking like right before we hit record about how, and he's downplaying it a little bit, but when you spend your PhD studying a disease, that's like 5, 6, 7 years of your life that all you're doing is studying that disease. And if he hasn't even heard of a variable at all during that time that's connected to the disease, it really speaks volumes about the strength of that connection between that variable and that disease. Like, it's just so much time to be just immersed in a literature of a disease or a disorder and just not even coming across a thing is just, it really speaks volumes to the lack of strength in that connection. So I just wanted to point that out there. Like,
yeah, and transparently for the listener, like coming in, Jess and Sarah, you were like, oh, can we talk about this thing? And I was like, honestly, I don't really know anything about the data on that. And like, I'm okay. I'm perfectly comfortable sharing that and admitting that, because I don't think that that's a failure of my read of the literature. I think it's that there is no literature of this, right? And if it is a failure of my reading of the literature, I'm accepting of that as well. But it sounds like, Jess, you did a good job of explaining the existing data on the link between acetaminophen and autism, and there is no link. So. Yeah, I mean, the fact that I don't know anything about it says a lot, because when you're in a PhD, basically all you do is read scientific literature for, several years straight. Mm-hmm. So never came across that.
All right, final thing, just because if I don't say this, I feel like we're going to catch heat. So a lot of this came out of this meta-analysis that was done jointly by Mount Sinai and Harvard. I think it was a meta-analysis of 46 studies, and 27 of them apparently found some sort of positive association between acetaminophen and autism. When you look at each of the individual studies, I mean, there were methodological issues with them. The data were collected so differently that they could not be combined and reanalyzed. And actually, the lead author on that meta-analysis himself said there's nothing in this that points to causation. He used the analogy of ice cream sales and violent crimes in the summer. Of course, they're correlated, but of course, ice cream doesn't cause violent crimes. There are a million different analogies we could use, to illustrate that point. But then just again, to come to your point, it all comes down to, do those studies properly assess, was it the acetaminophen or was it the underlying reason why those pregnant women were taking acetaminophen? So that, coupled with this massive Swedish study that did properly control for those things and found zero association, makes me feel comfortable saying that there is zero causal data linking acetaminophen and autism. All right. We're midway through the episode, Ben, and we haven't even asked you our kickoff question, which is, what is a news item that has caught your attention and why should people care about it?
Okay, so a few weeks ago, to fully pivot, actually, there was a study that came out and was covered, widely in the news about superagers. And Sarah, you mentioned before we started recording that you studied superagers, right?
Yes, I did. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University, which is where the Superagers Project was actually founded.
Yes. Can you please define a superager properly for the audience, that I don't botch it?
Yes, absolutely. So there are a couple of different definitions, but according to the original definition from the folks that started the study, superagers are defined as folks above the age of 80 that have the cognitive capabilities in terms of primarily looking at memory and executive functioning that are roughly around the age of folks that are 50, 60 years old. So usually with cognition, you experience with aging a certain amount of natural cognitive decline, not due to any sort of disease or disorder or degeneration, but just because of the aging process in general. But these people, this quote unquote super aging population, don't experience as rapid of a rate of decline, and in some cases don't experience a decline at all because they maintain those capabilities equivalent to folks decades younger than themselves.
Thank you so much for that. I'm also very glad to know that I have been properly defining superagers. That's what I thought it was.
Yeah,
so, okay, good. So what this new study pointed out, which is arguably not new, but the new study says that the unifying factor among all these superagers is that they are all very social. They live very social lifestyles. They're extroverts, and they take socializing seriously as like a pillar of their well-being and health. And they also, the new study also showed that they have all these favorable brain metrics, right? It's not just that they are performing cognitively at the level of someone 20 years younger, but that their brain actually looks healthier and younger. And by that, I mean, I guess to summarize it for the layperson, the brain looks thicker. You know, it's like when you're aging, your brain atrophies, it shrinks naturally. And they showed less of that. You know, they had thicker cortical regions, the cortex, the outer layer of the brain was thicker. They showed lower markers of like neuroinflammation, things like that. And I was contacted by the New York Times to give a quote about this article, this new study. And they were like, wow, this is unbelievable. Like, what do you think about this? And I said, this is completely unsurprising. I am not at all surprised about this whatsoever. As you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I just wrote a book on this topic, Why Brains Need Friends, which is all about why socializing is good for the brain and why isolation is bad for the brain. And like, if you could like feed my book into ChatGPT and be like, make up a fake study that proves all the points of this book so perfectly and like hits on every single topic, it would come up with this study. It was like every single like biological metric that they measured was exactly what the existing literature, decades worth of research on social interaction, says about what it does for the brain. And so it's exciting. It's interesting. It's I mean, satisfying for me because it's like, okay, great, my book is real. The information is real. But it's also it's significant from a public health perspective because, you know, socializing may be, well, not even maybe. If you ask me, socializing is one of the more effective ways we can support our health and well-being as we age, you know, and really at any age. And I think it's important no matter what age we are, but especially as we get older to sort of stave off the natural decline we all experience or even slow down dementia. There's actually evidence showing that more socially integrated dementia patients, their memory declines twice or half as fast. So the more isolated people, their memory declines twice as fast. So being socially connected, it matters a lot. So
wait, just a total anecdote, but relevant to this. I remember when I was doing my master's in my environmental health class, I caused a bit of a stir because of the very well established environmental implications of driving automobiles and pollution and stuff like that, right? But I made the case that cars were super important to allow especially older people to meet, to socialize, right? To break out of isolation. And so that caused a little bit of a stir. Obviously, there are pros and cons and there are downsides to automobiles, but that is so interesting. So, Ben, can you tell us more? So you talked about this in your book. Can you maybe pull out, 3 key takeaways or messages that you'd like to share that you discuss in your book?
Sure. Okay, so number 1, social interaction is good for us, duh. But what I mean by that is we are wired, human beings are wired so that we feel good when we interact with others. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if you think about it, human beings, we work really well in groups, we survive really well in groups. So, eons ago, millennia ago, when it comes to survival of the fittest humans were the ones who were the most social. And so our brains, we've evolved to have social reward systems in our brain so that when we socialize and we connect with others, we feel good. And neurotransmitters like dopamine, which are reinforcing, along with like serotonin, oxytocin, all these very positive, reassuring neurotransmitters that make us feel like we want to do this again, they come out to play. And so when we interact with others, we are actually, we're sort of tickling this like ancient system in our brains that tells us we are safe and we are healthy and we are happy. In addition to so by the way, yes, people do feel better after interacting. And that also, as controversial as this may sound, that is true for both introverts and extroverts. Introverts just require a much lower dose and are much more quick to fatigue. So short interaction will feel good for an introvert, but if they're forced to interact for like a week straight with people, it's like, please, I will do anything, like imprison me, let me out of here. Whereas extroverts, like they can go a whole week socializing or go on vacation with their family or friends for a week and come home feeling refreshed, whereas an introvert will come home from the same trip feeling
drained,
devastated. Yeah. So we feel good from interaction. That's number 1. Number 2, on the other hand of this sort of evolutionary conundrum, imagine in an ancient world, you are with your tribe, you're safe, you're fighting off predators, you're hunting, you're doing a great job of surviving. And then something happens where you get split off from your tribe. You are now by yourself. Your brain must have some system to tell you, threat detected. You are at a higher risk of dying out here by yourself. And so, because of that, social isolation, or being alone, is perceived by the body as a stress signal. It drives cortisol up, it triggers its HPA axis response, and so we become stressed. And by the way, interestingly, solitary animals that, like tigers, for instance, tigers are perfectly good at hunting on their own. They don't need to be in groups because it actually would just, they're so effective at fighting that they could just kill anything by themselves. And then if they were in groups, they would have to share it. So they're better off surviving alone. They show the exact opposite. So when they're with others, their cortisol goes up. Actually, sorry, they haven't done this in tigers, but in solitary species, their cortisol goes up when they're with others, whereas it goes down when they're by themselves. So it kind of shows you like we are wired for what we survive best, in what format we survive best in. But the problem is stress, chronic stress, and chronic activation of the stress system is bad for us and can lead to things like chronic inflammation if unaddressed long term. And so this, as much as I hate how like social media-y chronic inflammation has become as a term, this is like a legitimate problem. And I believe that, that at least the data suggests that the inflammation, sorry, my dog's chiming in. She has some, she wrote part of the book too. So that inflammation kind of puts our bodies in jeopardy. And so being isolated, being socially isolated is associated in some studies with like hundreds of thousands of people with a 50% higher risk of mortality by any cause. And to me, it makes sense that when you have this inflammation, you have all this chronic stress response, you're more prone to, high blood pressure, heart attack, things like that. When there's evidence that after strokes and heart attacks, those who go into a single housing environment are much more likely to have like adverse outcomes after that, or have another stroke or another heart attack, or die, or show weaker recovery. So basically, isolation is also bad for our bodies, while interaction is good. So we have this kind of twofold, like it's a two-sided coin, right? So when you're not getting enough interaction, you're sort of hurting yourself in multiple ways. And to point out also, the control group, when they're comparing the isolated folks with the non-isolated folks are also experiencing the benefits of socializing more. Okay. Number 3, I could go so many ways with this. I think the way I want to go here and wrap this all up is that, especially, I think it's really sensitive and important, coming straight out of a conversation about autism spectrum disorder to now talking about socializing so much is so good for you. Not socializing is gosh, how do I frame this? You cannot extend your life necessarily by maximizing your socializing, right? The way I view it, and what the data seems to suggest, is that everybody should try to identify what their kind of ideal social diet is. I use this term social diet in the book of like what we're taking in, right? And so for me, I'm very extroverted. My social diet might look like, a 2-hour helping of social interaction 3 times a week. And that's where I feel best. And if I exceed that, then I start to feel a little bit overwhelmed and I just really want to like hang out on the couch, right? And that's perfectly okay. At any level, if you get to the point where you're oversaturated, it's perfectly okay to withdraw. But, and I use the analogy of like a plant, right? So you have a plant that needs to be watered, right? The socializing is the watering. You can overwater a plant, and that's bad, but the soil will dry up and then the plant will be okay, right? So that's kind of when you withdraw, you're kind of receding a bit from that interaction. You're taking a break from your social diet. That's fine. But when you underwater a plant, it can legitimately die, right? If it's always dried out, it can be bad for the plant. And so what I worry about is that human beings are really good at sensing when we're overwatered, when we've had way too much interaction. It's very clear. I want to get out of here. I want to be alone. Right. We're not so good at understanding and recognizing I haven't had enough interaction, because when we start to feel off, there's so many other culprits, right? It's, I'm stressed about work. I didn't get a good night of sleep. I haven't really eaten today. There's so many things you can say about why you're not feeling well that we often don't realize that the plant needs to be watered. And so what I want people to do, and what my kind of message is not to like socialize every single day, but to make sure you're not bottoming out. Because when we bottom out and we're just, going extended periods without connecting, it's bad for us in many ways, not just our mood, but in our overall health. And it's also easy to get stuck into a loop where there's evidence that the more isolated you are, you can actually struggle with things like social reward. Like when you do reemerge and have a social interaction, you may not feel quite as, positive feelings from it. You may struggle with things like trust. You may pay more attention to negative social signals. There's all sorts of reasons why when you are very isolated, you may remain isolated. And so what I worry about is that people, especially right now when we're very polarized and we're very divided and there's all sorts of horrible things going wrong every day, that we are not connecting with our community. And that's probably exacerbating the way we're feeling about the world. And so, I want to remind everybody to connect and to think about connection and socializing, not just as like one little branch of your life that you do on Fridays just because you're bored if you don't do it, but that it's actually something that matters for your health, just like eating or sleeping or exercise or anything like that.
So I'm thinking about the pandemic a lot as you're talking, and it's so funny. I think I present as an extrovert, but I actually think I'm more introverted. So I don't know if I'm an extroverted introvert or an introverted extrovert, but and I'm not someone, I'm an only child. I sort of grew up doing my own thing. My social battery runs out very quickly. I just remember feeling aside from the whole threat of death that we were all terrified of, I just remember how much that isolation, it impacted my psyche. I bet there's been some really interesting studies that have come out of the pandemic, and yeah. So.
Yeah. I mean, people felt terrible, basically, which is, we didn't really need science to tell us that. But yeah, the longer people were isolated, the worse their depression scores were. Those who were sheltered alone versus with family members, those who were alone did worse and struggled more and faced more challenges. Yeah, no doubt. And what I think happened with the pandemic is, so our brains are constantly making predictions about the outer world, right? And so we get into habits and we get into just kind of expectations. And then when those predictions are wrong, we notice, right? There's a big surprise and the brain pays attention. And the reason it's paying such close attention is because it's trying to update its predictions so that it can predict more accurately in the future. And so when COVID first happened, our social lives were completely just dumped in the garbage, right? We went from whatever amount of social interaction you expected to have per week to zero. And so that was a dramatic difference. And your brain paid super close attention and everyone felt lonely and everyone felt terrible and it was awful. And so, but then when COVID ended and we re-emerged gradually into our social lives, that any level of interaction was now upturning our expected prediction of zero interaction, right? Like we completely reset our social predictions to zero. And I think that's really bad because I think even now, several years after what you might call the end of the pandemic, we are still, I'm not sure that we're completely recovered to our previous expectations. Where now, a couple interactions a week maybe is less than you used to get, but now it feels like a lot because it's less than, or it's a lot more than I used to get it before or during the pandemic, if you know what I mean. And so the thing is, though, just because our expectations have shifted doesn't mean that our needs have shifted, right? And I use the analogy of sleep. Imagine if the sun suddenly stayed in the sky for 8 hours more per day. And so there was only a small period of darkness. And so all humans collectively started getting 4 hours less of sleep. We would all feel terrible. But then after a couple of years of it, we would just expect that this is normal and we wouldn't even think about it anymore. But we would still be tired. We wouldn't notice it. Our predictions would have shifted, but our needs wouldn't have shifted. We'd all be exhausted. We'd be at higher risk of things like dementia and heart disease and all these conditions. But it would just be normalized. And I kind of think that's what's happening with social interaction, that the data are very clear. We're spending way less time together, way more time alone. The number of friends that people has is going down. There's all the evidence and data are pointing in the wrong direction. And, there's significant health consequences associated with that, but I don't think we're really noticing or at least taking it seriously. So not to sound the alarm, but I do think that we should take it seriously.
I'm thinking maybe since we're shifting towards the end of the episode, we should maybe try and end on a bit of a lighter and happier note, more of a hopeful note. Because we've been so far this season, and I really like this, Jess. This is probably my favorite part of every episode is just asking this question. Ben, what is something giving you hope right now in public health and science and in the world right now? It's a
Okay,
hard
let me
one.
give two answers. It is a
little bit right
Yeah.
now.
I'm like peeking into this really dark closet in my mind. I'm like, what the hell's in here? Okay, so I'm going to give two. First off, just to close out what I was just saying, super depressing information on a positive note, the solution is really simple. Connection, right? And that connection can be really whatever you want it to be. I mean, it can be, hey, I just realized, instead of seeing my family, I tend to FaceTime them. Let me get together with them in person. Or it could be, instead of I haven't gone to the grocery store in a year. Wow, I forget what it's like to be immersed in my community and maybe see someone I know and talk to the cashier because not because you've been not eating for a year, but because maybe you've been using Instacart to order groceries, right? Like things like that where you can identify little tiny places to supplement more interaction into your life, especially where it's been kind of replaced by the convenient automation of apps and things like that.
Yep.
Anything like that is great. And even like the other day, yesterday morning, actually, I was taking a walk. I was in LA. I don't live in LA, but I was in LA and I was walking on the street and I was passing a woman and I looked at her and I said, "Good morning." And she was startled. And then she said, "Oh, good morning." And she kept on walking. And I thought to myself, I wonder when the last time somebody said good morning to her passing on the sidewalk was. I feel like we've gotten so we're walking, we have headphones in, we have our phones out, we're so deep in our own little worlds that we pass people. And sometimes it's like our social predictions have shifted, right? Maybe we used to say good morning. We used to say, "How are you? How's your day? Can I pet your dog?" And now we kind of withdraw. And so even something as tiny as that, I felt immediately better after that. And I'm hoping she did too. I'm hoping I didn't scare her. But that kind of stuff where it's just like a little tiny connection with your community, especially when we feel so divided and we feel like everybody's different from us in some way, or, we all are kind of opinionated and we all feel differently about things. Just finding that little bit of connection is really, really important and gives your brain that satisfaction of like, oh, maybe I have more allies than I think, and I'm not so alone in this world that it kind of feels like I am. But as to answer your actual question, so one thing that gives me hope amid everything in science going wrong is... So I'm the Chief Science Officer of the Mind Science Foundation, and we fund research in neuroscience, and specifically on consciousness and research that it's intended to improve the human condition. And what makes me excited is that, we fund research and we have donors who support us, and we, they make donations, and then we kind of use that money to support research. And since the recent shift in the funding climate, what I've found is that a lot of these donors, when they realize what's going on, they're a lot more excited and motivated to support and to provide some, contribution to support research. And that to me is reassuring because there's a lot of people in the world and in America who understand the importance of science. And frankly, science is, when it comes to like the Department of Defense or whatever war it is now or something like that. But when it comes to like keeping America strong, right? Science is a bedrock of that, right? Like we need to have strong scientific research and medical research to keep progressing as a nation. And so I think that the fact that private organizations like ours can still support science and maybe even ramped up by this sort of human element of recognizing there's a problem, let's fix it. There may be some glimmer of hope in a solution that comes from sort of the people. So I am optimistic in that one small way.
Love it. Love it so much. Dr. Ben Rhine, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your new book dropping October 14th, Why Brains Need Friends, the Neuroscience of Social Connection. Again, we're going to drop links in our wherever our show notes. There you go. Ben, also, what is your social media handle so folks can follow you?
So it's just Dr. my name, Ben Rhine, BenRein.
Awesome. Thank you so much for everything you're doing, for all of your work, and for joining us today.
Oh, likewise. And thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure, and I appreciate talking with you both.
Sarah, take us home, please.
All right. Thanks, Ben. I really can't wait to read your book. And thank you all for tuning in. We hope you learned a thing or two. I certainly did. Please join us next week on your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.
Meet Keith, loving dad, board game champ, bus driving pro. I drive 65,000 miles in my bus each year. If people knew what I know, lives could be saved. Like how there are some things I simply can't see. On my route the other day, a car tried to sneak past me and ends up right in my blind spot. I turned slowly, so accident avoided. But no car should be in the blind spot for a 40,000-pound bus. It's our roads. It's our safety.
Visit www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.